Hmm? What's this?
Hi, I like 2nd edition.
Aww! You're coming home with me. My Windows 98 computer tells me that 2nd edition has come to an end. But what if you want to get into it? What if you want to go back to a simpler time for the Warhammer 40,000 rules? Well, you won't find it here. I'm a veteran of these times when most 40k players who are still playing started in the later, more rounded editions. So there are quite a few surprising things about 2nd edition if you are new at a 40k. Have I ever mentioned that I have been playing since 2nd edition? If you were a veteran of the times and want to go back to playing 2nd edition, you don't. You're lying to yourself because you don't remember what it was really like. Or maybe you just don't like the current rules, but that doesn't mean that the rules in the past were better. But I do remember having a lot of fun in 2nd edition. And I'm joined by my fellow 2nd edition expert, Olden Demon. Their videos are a truly excellent source of 2nd edition knowledge. You may just want to listen to us, or you can watch. I'll be popping back up with some of my own segments that have a more visual element. But now, you need to get a cup of tea and relax. We are going on a journey, but while staying still. An emotional journey, or perhaps a spiritual journey across the rules of 2nd edition. And that has to start with me getting something wrong. For balance, wasn't there meant to be a games master in every game?
I think that was Rogue Trader. I think they kind of cut that bit out, and 2nd edition, it was, here is the rules. But of course, it was still functionally still the Rogue Trader rule set, and by the end of that, it had turned into this 2nd edition war game that we kind of know about today. There's certain bits in 2nd edition where they're just like, work this out yourselves. Off you go on, make your own rules.
I don't know if that happens nowadays. People want really explicit direction.
In fairness, people just came to a consensus and just went, yeah, this is how we should do it. And then that way of doing it was moved into rules, and it changes every edition, really. Every edition seems to have different ways of dealing with cover and dealing with certain key elements of the rules that just kind of they need to kind of file down until they've got a nice, perfectly smooth surface. Even now, it's not quite perfectly smooth.
They'll work on it for 2 more years and then be like, right, scrap that edition, 11th edition, completely new. Totally different.
I'm going to say 12th is going to be completely new.
They tend to go in pairs. We've seen them going in pairs, 6th and 7th, 8th and 9th. A better conclusion to the recent Doctor Who series could be if the Doctor challenged the Toymaker to a game of 2nd edition 40k. Then the unclear rules could let the Doctor win on several technicalities. Or maybe the Toymaker would just collapse in a wave of contradictions. But right now, if you've been annoyed at the 10th edition rules where the Dark Eldar don't have that much synergy between their units, or that win rates are so varied among the factions, then you really wouldn't like the balance of 2nd edition. Because there wasn't any. A lot of that comes from the times, the 90s, and a different expectation of what was required from a rule set. I found that heavy weapons were just far too powerful. You would take half a tactical squad, the 4 guys with bolters would picnic in the park, while the 1 guy with the las cannon would be the only one doing any work.
But you might have skipped the key point there. You would only take the 5-man tactical squad if you had the appropriate issue of White Dwarf that told you that you could take a 5-man tactical squad rather than a 10-man tactical squad in the Codex.
So this is going to be exactly like the current rules. If you take the index version of the tactical squad, it comes in a unit of 10 and can fall back and shoot and charge. If you take the codex version, they can split into 2 squads of 5. It's funny how that loops back round.
Everyone is trying to adjust this on the fly, but back in the 90s, we didn't have the internet. So they would go, okay, well, we'll pop this in White Dwarf, and then the people who are in the hobby at that time and reading White Dwarf, which everyone did,
yeah,
or at least most people would do.
The way of actually finding out what's happening, and you got all of your cool hobby stuff. I suppose at that time it had been all 40k and Warhammer Fantasy. They weren't still doing D&D stuff.
D&D dovetailed out as Rogue Trader dovetailed in. You did have because I went back and looked, it was like issue 96 of White Dwarf is when, I think when Rogue Trader is released.
That's when my collection starts about then.
Yeah, and I think you still had a little, I don't know, they would have lost the D&D license by then, but you would have had role-playing stuff in there.
There were some things like Hero Quest, that kept coming up. Here's a new thing for Hero Quest, a new character for Hero Quest, a new mission for Hero Quest. Hero Quest is great. That's where you keep up the balance, or in theory, or how certain rules worked. I found that second edition worked better when there were no monsters or vehicles on the board, because that's a whole nother slew of rules you didn't need to think about.
Well, yeah, if they're not there, you don't need to think about them. But yeah, absolutely. For instance, actually buying a specific vehicle was not like it is today. You don't just go to eBay or you don't go to your Games Workshop store. If you wanted a Land Raider, they were long out of stock. There were rules for them. If you wanted a thing, you had to physically find it in a shop somewhere.
Yeah, then it's like, oh, go through all the charity shops in like Newcastle and try and find one there.
Yeah, or if you're on a holiday, if you just take a holiday inside the UK, you'd be like, can I just go down? There's a hobby shop down there. Can I just nip in there? Just see what their stock's like. The tale of second edition is the tale of what we used to do for fun before the internet turned up.
Oh, I do remember going in and saying like, oh yeah, there's the exact thing I want. It's a bit overpriced. Maybe they'll have it somewhere else. And they never do until like 10 years later when the internet came along and I was able to get one.
It's changed everything, and you can't really look at second edition without big elephant in the room, which is it was really a different time.
Oh, I thought the elephant in the room was a separate token that you got to decide how big something was.
Yeah, that was another one of those rules where they were just like, yeah, just work this one out yourself. Here's some rough.
Yes.
Here's a rough estimation.
And I say token because there wasn't a token. It was just, this is roughly the size, Land Raider or bigger. And if you didn't have a Land Raider, you had no idea what big was because Land Raiders are hard to come by.
I mean, the wording's not particularly great on a lot of different things because, it made sense for whoever wrote it, and it probably made sense when they explained it to whoever they were playing it against. We are kind of picking apart the carcass of a very old rule set and probably a company where everyone was, to put it mildly, kind of running by the seat of their pants most of the time.
And doing an entirely new thing of, this is the one system, we don't do do two systems and nothing else, rather than a range of gaming systems and different scales. And oh yeah, we've got some Napoleon stuff, we've got some English Civil War stuff, we've got some American Civil War stuff, and then they all have their separate lore. Keeping all of them rule sets going and also all the models going, this was just, we do this and develop it how we want. It's not history, so we don't know how it's going to go. The balancing stuff. So there wasn't a worry in like second edition that when you bought a new unit, it wouldn't get nerfed or changed before you finished building it. You knew exactly what you were getting, and that was going to last the whole edition, with maybe a White Dwarf FAQ.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, I don't know whether they ever had any White Dwarf FAQs for units or anything like that. I don't think they ever did a balance.
No,
FAQ.
Not really a balance, just this is how it's meant to work.
This is how it's meant to work. The rules, displacer fields, the wording is confusing and we don't quite know how that works. And they're like, okay, this is how it should work. And it's like things like, oh, well, hold on. The rules for this specific weapon say that the model is turned upside down, but what about these models that would be fine if they were turned upside down, and these other models that look like they wouldn't be fine if it was turned upside down? And they were like, okay, well, in these cases it works like that, and in these cases it works like that.
Yeah, so they have things like what kind of cards do the Genestealer cult use for like psychic powers and strategy cards? Like, oh no, they use the normal strategy cards. They don't use Tyranid strategy cards because in second edition Genestealer cult, despite Genestealers being what you think of as Tyranids, they were still a separate army.
Yes, because Genestealer cults had strategy cards. It was Tyranids that had the, what was it called? I've got the book here. It was a special the special little Jones is acting strangely thing. Does it actually have a name?
It's just listed down here as various Tyranid charts.
Yeah, it never actually had a name. Just roll on the table opposite for each different type of thing.
There we go. That's its name. The table opposite.
The table opposite. The table on the other page. So if you're a squad, you'd roll 1 dice. On a 1 to 3, no effect. On 4, 5, or 6, weird stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much the same for everything else. Actually, characters were interesting there. On a 1, the character hates Tyranids.
Ah, that's a bonus for them.
2 or 5, okay. And then 6, the character was wounded. In fact, the Tyranid Codex, I'm going through it for a video now, Andy Chambers had to basically re-edit the entire rulebook to fit in all of these Tyranid special rules.
And then you had the Mind Worms, so you could take over other squads and have them in your army.
More like he had to redo the shooting phase and the targeting rules.
Oh, right, yes.
And the missions had to change, and the war gear cards, obviously they couldn't use war gear cards because second edition was very much almost two skirmish human forces who would think about battles like humans would fight each other, and the human forces would think about things like raiding people's supply dumps and assassinating their character or killing their psyker or someone like
They
that.
have had that kind of issue for a lot of things. It's like, oh, how do you do Necrons in an attacking... How do you do Orc Strongholds defending something? You can do it, it works. How do you have defend against an assassination target from a psyker when you're Tau and you don't have any psykers? How did Dark Eldar do defensive things when they're always in the webway and they do strikes? Because there was a rule in the past where they're always the attacker. That was just how it is.
Third edition, that was the thing where they came out, and that was their thing. And it's difficult because how do you add in the flavour like that
while keeping the rules working?
Because what's flavourful and appropriate for one army is completely wrong for another army, or what's flavourful for one unit or one weapon.
Yes, how do you attach a vortex grenade to a hive tyrant and have the hive tyrant throw it?
Yes, there's so many things that the rule set simply would start to fall apart. And of course, you know, the first thing that would happen is that if they publish something like this these days, is people would be like, these rules are stupid, they don't make any sense.
Well, you'd have two different groups, maybe with overlap, with saying, the narrative doesn't fit this army at all, I don't like them. Or the rules don't work for tournament play, I don't like them.
I mean, that's why you pretty much couldn't run it too much these days, except between a group of people who absolutely know what they're getting into. Or they know exactly what they're getting in for. It's the nostalgia, and they're going to try and make the best of it that they can, and they'll just effectively treat it like a role-playing game. Back to the role-playing setting that it kind of came from.
Well, you do need your D4s, D8s and D12s, which you would get from being D&D players, because you didn't get D8s and D12s and D4s in the starter set.
You didn't, although apparently you did get them in shops at the time, although I have yet to see a single image of a blister pack containing these dice anywhere ever.
Maybe. No, I think it was just generally assumed that if you played D&D, you might also like Warhammer. 40k was a much smaller game in 2nd edition. It was basically a skirmish game with some bits added on. It was a different time, so you didn't need as many models, and the range of units and models available was also much smaller. So if you think of the Battle Sisters and their iconic units, there was no Exorcist, there was no Repentia, there was no Celestians, which we have lost again. But they did have Fraternus Militia, and if you still have those models, as I do, run them as novitiates. Despite the number of models being much reduced compared to the armies we're used to of the 10th edition, the table size that you were expected to use for most of the games was 8x4, so these could be quite spread out affairs. But the tables were about the only thing that were larger. There were far fewer factions as well. No Tau, no AdMech models, no Imperial Knights in your 40k games. The lack of Tau might actually be considered a good thing, but armies were smaller, and that was great. 60 Imperial Guard infantry was 1,500 points rather than 350. A 2,000 point army was very achievable, but unlike with modern 40k where you can make it work well for like 750 points through to 3,000 points where the only limit is time, 2nd edition found its gears grinding if you tried to play more than 1,000 points. That was, if you can figure out how to play the game at smaller than that, right?
Yeah, to put it mildly, I'm still making the rules videos for it, and the reason I started making the rules videos for it is to actually learn how to play the game properly.
And then you play it yourself and you're like, if I have to make a video about it, I'll actually look deeply into these rules and figure out how they work.
If I'm spending this much time editing them, I can find all of the problems with it, then I can put that up as an example of how you play this game, because different phases had different amount of work put into them. And certain phases, like the psychic phase, is just like, just do this.
Yes, here's a set of cards, draw some cards.
Here's a set of cards, here's like a paragraph of how the psychic phase works. Off you go.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, do anything with a vehicle. Here's pages and pages of rules.
Which I just skipped out. Orc Dreadnoughts, the Eldar Warwalker, things like that. The Avatar and its interesting rules that upset Sisters of Battle. The Screamer Killers that could have a 4+ invulnerable save, which was considered quite powerful among people who've played it. Like, maybe that's a bit
and
much.
regenerate as well. But the thing is that heavy weapons were so powerful. You could take a 5-man tactical squad with a heavy weapon, and that heavy weapon would just completely destroy things because it would do far too much damage. It would act to characters in the same way that you would think being hit by an anti-tank gun would do to a normal human.
Yes. Future lasers are designed to go through future armor. And this was replaced in later editions with the instant death rule. It's that strength is twice your toughness, just die. You just die.
Yeah. And if you're, it doesn't matter how large your alien creature is, it'll still kill them very, very easily because in real life, if this was really happening, if you fire one, the tank will die. And of course, if the tank has been replaced with a Carnifex, then there's not really much that's different there fundamentally. If you fire the big gun at it, it'll still die.
If you scale it up, that is a bullet-sized hole in someone, which we know does kill people.
But of course, obviously, if you watch a Godzilla movie, if you fire something against Godzilla, it doesn't die at all.
Ah, but that's where the scale was a bit different in 2nd edition, where it's like a Dreadnought is roughly as high as it goes, whereas now we have Knights and potentially Titans as an even larger level. So it's like, oh, this new Tyranid monster is bigger than a Carnifex.
Yes.
Yeah, it's got a scale in threat level all the time.
When it was released in 93, they just thought Carnifex is going to be as big as it gets because...
That's the model they can produce, yeah.
I mean, we can go up to Land Raider size, but that's...
Even then, they were kind of small for what you consider a Land Raider. People think of the 30k new Land Raider when they think of Land Raiders, whereas they were much smaller.
There was a lot of special rules that just had things like, oh, and if you roll a 6 or if you roll high enough, the model is just killed. And that would make sense if you're just running around with Carnifex or Hive Tyrant scale or Dreadnought scales, but as soon as you start to get to super heavy vehicles and stuff, it just dies instantly.
Structure points were brought in, and it wasn't just this old priest with some crack grenades now blows up a Chaos Dreadnought, which was, at the time, one of the biggest units there.
It was a venerable old rule set, and they didn't know how things were going to turn out, and we are fortunately living in the reality where Warhammer 40,000 did continue to sell.
One of the items that Games Workshop sells now is plastic terrain. There was some terrain available, but there was a very different attitude that is epitomised by one of the most beloved books of all time, How to Make Wargames Terrain. It encourages you to make your own, it shows you how to do it, it shows you all the materials that you're going to need and step by step to make certain bits. It was great, but that is of course thinking as a younger person who had a lot more time than money. Now I have some more money, but not as much time. So being able to buy preset terrain is really nice. But they had that in 2nd edition as well. There were full buildings given away in White Dwarf. Here is my own Sisters of Battleshine that came with the White Dwarf 212, all folding card, the floor I made from the parts of the window that you're encouraged to cut out, and I put it all on a polystyrene base. Now, Sister Superior Diana can be very happily reconsecrating the building near some White Dwarf barricades that came out with the release of the Space Marine Scouts in metal. Scouts, of course, fought off Tyranid warriors, and my Battle Sister is doing the same here. Oh, not that Tyranid warrior. What's that doing there? No. This is perfection. This is a proper Tyranid warrior. All with terrain that came out in your monthly magazine, and in full colour. An advantage it has over the modern terrain, although it is a lot more fragile and you can't just sling it in a box and throw a pile of Gene Stealers on top and expect it all to be okay. It wasn't just White Dwarf where you got terrain. You could buy some card buildings like this Imperial Guard command tower. It doesn't seem like the terrain of today, but it's something cool. There were campaign books, sort of like the modern day Crusade books with the setting, 2 factions paired against each other, but these had 3 preset scenarios for you to refight, but with an uncertain conclusion. Warhammer Fantasy heroes like the Red Duke came from campaign packs like the Circle of Blood, which came with terrain. These are still floating around on the internet, but require you to print on card, and my printer takes paper. I'm sure it would be possible. I'll have to look into it, but I will have a video on terrain options in the next month. All of these different terrain pieces had some sort of rules. These strange cacti that were mostly cocktail sticks became spikers. They just got their own rules for Kill Team alongside Terror Squirrels and the Catachan Brainleaf. So you had to know how they interact with movement and things like infiltrating units. So depending on what your opponent knew, every game could have a different set of rules.
there are certain rules that people didn't know about back in the day, and that became a way of playing the game. So, for instance, like blocking people, like move blocking people.
Yeah.
That was a big thing, 8th edition, where you would just move in front of your opponents because you moved so fast and people would not be able to move around it. That just wasn't a way you ever played. No one knew how to do that or knew why you would do that back in the day, probably because the missions didn't work that way. But that wasn't a thing. It wasn't thought of as a kind of, these models have to be moved around. Why would anyone do that? So they never put any rules in there. They never balanced it. No one ever knew that was a big thing until one day someone looked at the rules in a tournament and just went, oh yeah, I can do this with my big unit of 40 whatevers, and if I do that, then I win the game, right? And then people are like, yeah, we should probably change the rules to do that, but you can't take it back.
Oh yeah, that happened a lot in, was it the start of 8th edition with flyers? It was like, I'll use this flyer to block enemy movement. This flyer being here stops you completing actions.
That was suddenly a thing in the game that we didn't have. And the thing is, going back and playing an old game now, knowing that is a thing that you can do.
Yeah, it changes it a lot.
Fundamentally change it a lot.
I much liked it with the errors were different. Like, in the Tyrannid Codex for 2nd edition, the rules for spore mines were different depending on which page of the 2nd edition codex you were looking at.
I've got that next to me. Is it? Do they change the rules?
There was an FAQ about spore mines. I'll get you the page numbers.
Wow. So I bet we can do this live and you can just edit it all together.
There are 2 different sets of rules for Tyrannid Codex for what happens with spore mines. Page 26 of the 2nd edition Tyrannid Codex says the models within D6 inches will be hit on a 4, 5, or 6.
Yeah.
If you look at page 72 of the Tyrannid Codex, it says they will explode, hitting absolutely everything within D6 inches.
Oh, yes, of course, because another thing that's changed is that they've changed the way that the army books are formatted, because they used to be formatted in a really, really weird, but very charming and really fun to read.
I did like that. Here's the lore, here's the unit stats and their rules, and then you get a essentially quick reference in the back.
But of course, the quick reference and the rules, in this case, it looks like, didn't necessarily add up.
Oh, the answer to the spore mine thing was only on a 4, 5, or 6. Page 26 is the correct version.
That makes sense, because it's the first big chunk of rules that you'd see all of the main rules in, and then it kind of gets broken down and made into a smaller version for the army list. The balance patches, we never had that in 2nd edition. That's all we know, points changes.
That's it. No edits to the Eldar units, nothing like that. Then again, chess has not been updated for centuries, despite an obvious patch being needed for when the knight clips through other pieces.
Well, you say that. I have a script written about it, because I've obviously done the chess analogy. Chess has been updated, and it's been updated recently as well.
My goodness. Well, there goes my chess joke. It's like, I counter your chess joke with an upcoming video.
Yeah, the rules of chess have been updated recently. I think it was something to do with the pandemic, and because a lot of people were playing chess online during the pandemic.
Yes.
If you were in a certain type of tournament, who wins if there's a stalemate? And basically their final game, they had something like 7 matches, and every single one of them was a stalemate, because they were both very good. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew that a stalemate counts for a draw, even if the player who is effectively getting into the stalemate is losing.
Yes, you could force a draw from that, yeah.
Keep forcing draws to avoid losing, and I think that's what the update to chess, the core rules of chess does. If you move into a stalemate situation, that counts as a loss. So to some extent, yes, I have just ruined your clever little aside there, I think, by saying, yeah, actually, no, chess has had an update.
But that's clearly just a tournament for FAQ. It doesn't apply to the rest of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, with how many people who play chess around the world are going to know that is a thing.
I mean, when I did a whole video about the tournament FAQ for Games Workshop, which isn't actual rules, but potentially some guidelines.
It's the same with 2nd edition 40k. If you publish an FAQ and no one sees it, is it really published? Who knows? Those players probably just picked up the game and just played it and probably got rules wrong, because it was just 2 people playing it. And occasionally you might have some people around you, if you're playing it in a Games Workshop store at that time, who might say, that's actually not the correct rule, this is how you do this bit, or you might ask for help. But if you're playing the game and you're enjoying it, then great.
I remember what I used to do in like 2nd and 3rd edition. If you don't have someone around to ask, we got the landline and phoned up the local Games Workshop and asked them how the rule worked. Whatever the staff member said on that day is what we went with.
Oh yeah, you could do that, couldn't you? Yes, of course, because of course landlines and phone numbers, and it wasn't one-man stores back then, it was like 2 or 3-man stores. So if you phoned up, someone's going to pick you up.
You try and break D&D, you absolutely can very easily. You try and break one-page rules, you very easily can. But that's not the intention.
No, if you want to play this today, it's a pretty much play by intention, and we all know exactly what we're going for here. And eventually, I'll have a big list, because I'm planning on doing something like this, which will be like everything that you need to chat to your opponent with before the game, just to clarify how you think this game's going to work, so you don't get like 2 hours into it and then you all have a completely different understanding of how this critical key combat rule works.
Yes. Like usually at the start of current games, you're like, how do you think cover works? Because I think cover works like this. And then you add in house rules and things. So we have a general thing of, if you can see all of the base, the model is not in cover. So if your Screamer Killer with its massive arms has one claw behind a wall, it's not in cover. Even though technically that's how the rules suggest you do get cover.
Yeah, and I understand that there do need to be rules like that for tournaments, but they're the least sexy part of the rule books for me. It's like talking about cover and talking about how, what's the other extremely dull part of it? Moving up and down terrain. It's like every time I read a wargaming rule set and they go into this, I'm like, skip this bit boring, get to the interesting bits. I know it needs to be in there, but
if I never climb on a roof, I think I'll be fine.
Yeah, learning how to play a wargaming rule set is hard work. I mean, learning how to play anything is hard work. And the more complicated it gets, the harder it gets. And the wargaming rule sets are going to be about as complicated as you're going to get a rule set.
Well, the Age of Sigmar ones are laid out as a legal document. Turn to, if you look at paragraph 28.1, compare it to 28.2, you'll see that 28.1 takes precedence, as said by 28.3.
That's one way of doing it. Not the most exciting thing to read.
Oh, not at all. It really put me off 3rd edition of Age of Sigmar.
But there are people out there who will need them in that format for their tournament play. If the tournament rules look woolly and look weird, we'll think that that is how people play it. And we'll say, okay, I don't really want to do that then if everyone's going to be playing it in this really weird...
Yeah.
And it turns into like move blocking everyone, and everyone's like playing it in a really cagey way. I'm like, well, that doesn't sound fun.
That doesn't sound fun.
And unfortunately, online, those audiences are different size.
Or maybe it's commitment. There's probably far fewer tournament players than we think, but because they talk about it so much online, whereas people who have just had a fun narrative game aren't posting their narrative ongoing story somewhere like on a WordPress, on Archive of Our Own, and getting continuous views on, ooh, I wonder what happened to Sister Agatha when she's fighting the war boss. Surely that's coming up. And tournament players are probably the most invested, so they talk the most about it, whereas people who casually play open play once a month, they're not going to post online about that.
This is very true, yeah. Tournament players will absolutely want to know, okay, what's going on with this new unit? Is it being balanced? When is the balance data slate happening? When is that taking into effect? Is this going to be in effect with the tournament that I'm going to?
Yes, and then you've got to check with the managers of that tournament. Are we using that data slate? Or do we not have enough time? Are we using this codex? Maybe people wouldn't have had enough time to get the codex and learn the rules.
Yeah, and if you like going to tournaments, great. If that's what the hobby is to you, then that's great. And if it's a very, very kind of personal thing. You're going to have to chat to the event organisers and you're going to have to plan for this. And that is what the hobby is.
Yes, assuming the event organisers have got the Necron Codex and figured out all of the issues beforehand to make rulings on things, which they probably wouldn't have.
This is why I've seen in so many occasions people set out to make like miniature games and things like that, and they just think, you know what, let's just make a board game. Yeah, the game's very much changed. If you have a question now, it's get out your phone, Google it, and Reddit will have it. Reddit will definitely have it.
Although, what happened to me recently was I didn't know something about, it might have been Inferno Pistols. I searched it, and the second reply on Reddit was, you should try looking at Christian Von Carmian's videos. He probably has the answer. I was like, well, that's very nice that you'd give me as a source, but I'm back to square one. He doesn't
That's
know.
very impressive.
I
He's
know that
pointing
he
back
doesn't
to
know.
you. Oh dear. Do you know what the answer is, or is it an FAQ, or does
Oh,
no
it
one?
was turned out to be
Nothing
not
know?
important. This was like interacting with Crusade rules.
Oh, okay. If it's interacting with Crusade rules, then you're probably not gonna. If it's a cool rule in the rule book, if it's something like that, no one's going to be asking you too many questions during a, your friend's Crusade with your gaming group. No one, just work it
No, it
out
was
between
just like,
yourselves.
if you have a pair of Inferno pistols, does one of them get upgraded or do both get upgraded because it's
Oh,
one
I
profile?
see. Yes.
It's like,
No one's going to have FAQ'd it or noticed it at all. Anyway, a lot of people that come to my channel say things like, "I don't even remember the game. I never used to play it like this. I just come here for the history because I'm curious." So it's not just nostalgia, although that drives a lot of miniature wargaming.
yes, hey, do you remember this? Remember when you were a teenager and you got this game? Well, now you're an adult with potentially disposable income. Do you want to get it?
Yeah, it's like, do you remember the Goth Rockers or the Noise Marine with the guitar? And you're like, that's pretty cool that they're doing that. That's pretty cool. And occasionally they'll bring back, squats. We got squats, didn't we? Kind of are squats. Kind of. They've got a kind of trike, and they're kind of sport dwarfs, and that's out as close as you get. But yeah, nostalgia's a key factor of playing this game, and I think that's probably what people play it for. I don't know whether I know anyone who is alive who currently plays it who didn't used to play it.
Yes, there's not a lot of people who are like, well, now that I've seen Olden Demon's work, I'm going to start playing 2nd edition rather than any of the new stuff.
I don't know of anyone who's done that. Granted, I haven't asked them.
I'll see if they can put it in the comments of this video if they are one such person. Oh, come on, you don't want to play 2nd edition. You just want to be young again and play the edition of 40k that was around in your childhood. That might be 2nd edition, or it might be 4th edition, or 6th edition. Any later than that and you were a child and YouTube tells me that basically no one under 18 watches my videos. There must be some other vampire that more appeals to their teenage humour.
Like the candles on the shelf.
But you can get into 40k and then enjoy wargaming. It becomes a hobby. The same game becomes a hobby. Yeah, or it's more of a BBC's Who Do You Think You Are? Let's look at 40k and see what their ancestors in 2nd edition were like.
Yeah. Honestly, it's being probably propped up with the fact that 40k is an ongoing game and is not completely dead. So there are people who will look back and just go, oh, I really like this new game that I discovered yesterday. I might have a little look at how it developed.
Well, that's part of what I was thinking. When people see my channel who talks about the current edition, I keep wanting to say 11th edition because you said it so much, 10th edition, they may think, now I can go look at Olden Demon's channel and see what happened in the past.
The past is a weird place. Lots of weird things happened because we didn't know any better.
Oh, do you remember that part of your childhood playing Warhammer? Oh, it was so nice to be able to waste a Sunday playing. No worries about the coming week. No fear that if you bought some models, then you wouldn't get round to painting them. Just joy and free time. Oh, you were so happy then. Do you remember that childhood joy? Did you have that? It was so much nicer than trying not to look desperate for tip money or trying to build a business from the ground up.
Yeah, I think it is predominantly nostalgia.
Oh, bright colours! 2nd edition was before everything got dark and gritty. Some people refer to this as the time Games Workshop tried to branch out to America, and maybe that's why there are so many cowboy-themed models. But I don't know that much about US history. Which is to say, I probably know about as much US history as someone who went through the United States school system. No offence. But 40k stayed very British. It isn't ever truly the end of the world. No fire and brimstone, just the slow decline of an empire. And then even when the worst happens, the attitude is, oh, that was a bit rubbish. Unlike the occasional comment on this video, there's no one chanting, USA, let's go! Just a sigh at the government administrative problems and then we carry on. That is the Imperium of Man. Sad times. Actually, that could be a lot of countries, but that is why the bright colours of 2nd edition are such a great distraction. Unless things are truly terrible in your youth, you were shielded from all of those bad things and you didn't have to hear about the wars on TV. You were sent upstairs to paint Space Marines. And you painted them in bright colours, shiny green bases, eye-catching red bolt guns. It was so good, I've kept up the practice. And then we just need something nice to go on top of the base. What do you use to flock your... Well, I'm saying flock your bases already. So I use flock on the bases, even though...
Hold on. Tell you the exact stuff that I use. Here it is. Right. Okay, green bases. You want green base?
Absolutely. Goblin green bases.
Right. Woodland Scenics, Ballast, Fine Buff. And that is, I believe, a very fine... It's technically crushed rock.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a code here. B73. I assume this B73 code means something. You get your PVA, you pop your PVA on your base, and then you sprinkle this onto the base. You sprinkle it from a height so that it all settles properly. You don't scoop it through, because people scoop. They have like a tub and they scoop models through.
That is how I do it.
No, if you do that, you'll find that it won't be even.
Oh, I wouldn't want it quite even, because I like the idea that the grass grows different levels.
Yes, well, if you don't want it even, scoop it. If you want it even, like the appropriate era Citadel miniature, you sprinkle it so it will create a fine, even dispersal. I do have a hex pot of Goblin Green. In fact, I have many hex pots of Goblin Green, because it's one of those colours that you like.
Yes, I will need lots of these.
Eventually, it's going to go away. Best to have it and not need it. If you don't have or access to a hex pot of Goblin Green, War Boss Green from Citadel, that's close enough. And to be honest with you, you don't need it any closer than that for any good reason, because game stores, if you're putting them in a game store, the lighting is always terrible and it's going to be so dark, no one is going to notice. And online, as soon as you start taking a photograph, the saturation changes, the contrast changes, and the curves change depending on what phone you're using. And literally the only reason you would ever need a full color match is if you were going to use a big camera and you're going to shoot it in RAW and try and literally have the colors perfect, and no one's going to look that tired. But yeah, it's your fine
look
buff.
That detailed at a base, because that's just the thing it stands on.
That's how I do it. But of course, feel free to play around. If you've got that original Hexpot green, go for it. If you've got the original Hexpot Sunbirth Yellow, that's
I
probably
still have that
you.
one. It's just very thin.
You might struggle with that, because those yellows were super thin, and trying to get them to stick onto things is going to be tricky.
Importantly, as long as it's got a green base, then it'll match my Battleotron maps and the much nicer maps that you have on your channel. Look at the battle reports of the time. They didn't use photos of the number of models and wordy descriptions of where they are and what is happening. They used a big green map that made it easy to see where every model in the army is. If you end up watching one of Olden Demon's map videos, tell him, I am here because of the vampire, and he will know what that means. This is only one part of the talk we had, the structured part. Turns out when you put two players in a room and talk about a niche specialist subject, they don't shut up. So our longer ramblings have been kept in a separate video. As we were speaking of the green display maps of Olden Demon, here is one of his videos with such a battle map. Or there is that part of the video where I talked about templates. And that longer rambling talk about all things gaming is linked here as well. I know things got a little bit existential for a moment, but we have advice for that.
Don't worry, everything will be fine.